All right, so tile mapping. Um, yeah, whatever. That wasn't in the first part. So, anyways, tile mapping workshop. So tile mapping is like where you take a bunch of sprites that repeat called tiles, and you can kind of like draw them all over the place. And it makes it a lot easier to make stuff like Mario. If you think of the old ones, you've got the tiles, so you've got like the blocks, and it's tile mapping just makes it like super easy to make games like that. Really good for game jams. Wink, wink. Um, so I posted in the Discord the link to the download page. If you haven't done that already, you should just go here and download the tile mapping asset pack. Hopefully you already or you have access to that. I think you do. But inside of here, we've got the player prefab along with the script that controls it, just so you don't have to do that. And then the textures that we'll be using for this workshop. So, assuming you have that downloaded, you can just open up Unity. If you want to use the project from last time, that works. If not, you can make a new one too. It doesn't matter. I'm just going to be using the newest version of Unity for this. And a 2D. So yeah, once you have it downloaded, it'll be a zip. You just have to extract it. Extract all. It'll do its thing. And then once you have that there, it'll be all in a folder. I just gotta wait an eternity for Unity to boot up. So yeah, once you got Unity pulled up, you can literally just take the unzip folder and do that. It'll copy it in there. And then what I'm gonna do is take all these and move them, oops, not into that one, into assets and just delete that. Okay, so the first thing we want to double check before we get started is to make sure that we actually have the packages that we need to use the tile map stuff. You should have it by default if you created a project in 2D, but sometimes you create it in 3D by accident. It's like whatever. So if you go to Window and then Package Manager, it'll open up the Package Manager window. And in here is like a bunch of like extra things that you can install to help you like do different things in Unity, like sprites and pixel perfect mode and animations and stuff. So in this case, we want to make sure that we are in the Unity registry, so we see the entire list of everything. And then just double check that the tile map editor is installed. It should have a little check mark there. And then also make sure that 2D Sprite is also installed. And then there's also 2D tile map extras, which you don't need for this workshop. But if you want to do like some more advanced things with tile maps, you should probably download this. All right. So once you know those are there, we'll start actually making the tile map. So if you go into the textures folder from the assets, there's just one picture in there. So if I open this up, so this is like the sprite sheet. So what we're going to do is, since there's a bunch of different tiles, a bunch of different textures, we're just going to take this and we're going to split it up into different textures that we'll be able to use on the tile map. And as well as some other things like the player and the like car is also in here, but those won't be actually on the tile map. Those will be used for other things. But it's usually, especially for like Unity, it makes the game a lot faster when you have lots of textures in one big texture, just because of the lookup speed. Then you don't have to open up a separate file every time you want to check an image. So games that like Minecraft, for example, it's known for having its everything in one big file, just because it's a lot faster to look up everything. So that's the same thing with the tile map, pretty much. So what we want to do is first make sure it's a sprite type, and then because we have lots of pictures inside of here that we want to get, we actually have to change the sprite mode to multiple, so that we're telling Unity that we want to split it up into several different sprites. And we also want to change the pixels per unit to 32, and the reason for this is because of the way that Unity scales things. So if you kind of look in the scene view, it's got like the grid. Each cube is 1 by 1 units, and so when we change the pixels per unit, we're saying that there's 32 pixels per sprite in each unit. So this will scale the amount of, like, basically scale it so that each tile is exactly 1 by 1 in the game, which will make things really easy to do the tile map then.
Is there an advantage to between 132?
You can do any size you want. It really just depends on how long you want to spend on drawing textures, because if you have more pixels, it takes longer. I mean, realistically, you could do like HD with like 2048 by 2048, but that would also be very resource intensive because it's like higher resolution. We just did 32 by 32 because it's like enough to like draw something, but it's also like not too small either, or like not too big, not too small. It just works. You can do whatever size you want, though. Typically, though, you should do a multiple of 2 or of 8, because that helps with, it's because of the bits, but it also just helps with, like, it scaling things so it just looks nicer, because sometimes if you have, like, an odd amount of pixels, it'll look goofy. So we're going to change that. We're also going to change a couple other things. We want to make sure wrap mode is on clamp, and then the filter mode is on point. And we're doing this because it's pixel art. So bilinear means that it blends pixels together a little bit, which is good for like big pictures, like high resolution. But we don't want it to do that when we only have 32 pixels. So we're going to tell it not to do that, no filter. And then we also want to change the format to RGBA 32-bit. And this will also not compress the image at all, and it'll keep the colors like exactly what they are on the sprite. Since it's already small, we don't need to compress it. And then hit apply once you're done. Next up, we will be actually editing it. So if you go up here, there should be a Sprite Editor button. You can just go ahead and click on that. And it should pop up with this window. If it's not full screen, you can just drag this around and make it full screen. It just makes it easier to edit everything. Did you say something?
Where's the Sprite Editor button?
It should be just in here. Yeah, so if you click on the image in the folder, and then should be in the inspector. Yep. So this pulls this up so we can see everything, and we've got a couple options here. We won't worry about some of those. But what we want to do is we want to click on slice. So what we're going to do is we're going to tell Unity to slice up this image into a bunch of smaller images. There's different ways of doing this. You can click automatic, which is nice if you have everything like evenly cut out like these cars. But for these roads, for example, they are not spaced out at all, so automatic doesn't quite work. So what we're going to do is we're going to do it by size. And this just means that Unity is automatically going to cut it up based on how many pixels we tell it to do it by. And since we know that it's 32 by 32, we can change the pixel size to 32 and 32. And then you can kind of see the red like highlight of it automatically doing it. And once you got that, you can just click slice. And now everything has been sliced up into a bunch of small images. It just ignores the empty space here, which is nice. Then you don't have a bunch of sprites you don't care about. But one thing you may notice is that it did cut the buildings into 2 different ones, and we don't want that because we can just, it's a lot easier just to have them as one sprite, so you can just click and drag it in as opposed to having to drag both the top and the bottom at once. So what we're going to do is if you click on the box on one of them and then you just hit delete, it'll just delete that half of the sprite, so now there's nothing here. Oops. Whereas there's still one block here. So basically, all we're going to do is drag it over to the side, or you can also edit the size down here. And now this tile is 32 by 60 or 64 by 32 pixels, which is fine because it still fits the ratio that all the tiles fit. All right, so I'm also going to do the same thing for these 2 buildings. I'm just going to drag up and make them bigger. Make sure you don't drag by the green, because that has to do with like when it repeats, like where it's telling it to repeat, which if you ever get into like buttons and stuff, you might have to deal with that with UI. But in this case, we don't want to worry about that. We want to drag the blue line because that's the actual outside of the sprite. And then everything else should be good, because everything else is pretty much just fits within one tile, so we don't need to worry about it. So then we can just click apply. Okay, then we'll close out of that. So now we got it all split up, which is nice. So if you go back to the image in the project view, you can now click this arrow and it should have just like a list of all the different sprites that are inside of it. So now you're able to like use them. So if I wanted just to drag that out, I could do that. But that's not what we're going to do. We're going to actually use the tile palette to draw all over the place. It makes it super easy. It's not too hard to do. So and to open up the tile palette, if you go to Window, and then 2D, and then Tile Palette, that'll open up the Tile Palette window. And I personally like having it on the right side here, next to the scene, or just because it's nice and big. It's really easy to see. So I'll open up this view here, and we want to create a new palette since we don't have one yet. And I'm just going to call it like tile map. Sometimes if you're making like different maps, you don't want to have all the sprites in one tile map. Sometimes it's easier to split it up and make different palettes to pick from. But in this case, we don't really have that much, so we're just gonna put it all in one. And then once you name it whatever you want to name it, you can press create, and it'll pop up with this. Where do you want to save it? And just so everything is organized, we're gonna put it in the textures folder, but we're gonna make a new folder. You could put it directly in textures, but then the folder gets filled up pretty fast. And I'm just going to call the new folder palettes. And then we're going to put it inside of here. Yeah. Okay, so now if you open it up, it's inside of here. It has a little palette thing. You don't need to worry about that though. Unity does all that. So now we've got a palette, but we don't have any stuff in here. So it says in gray text, it says drag tile sprite or sprite texture assets here. So what's that telling us is that we can take these and we can drag them into the palette. However, we don't want to drag them individually because every time you drag a sprite into that window, it'll ask you where you want to save it. So if you do all of these individually, it's going to take forever. So you can just take the actual like big sprite map and you can just drag it in here like this. And then you can just put this inside of palettes, or if you want to be organized, It's usually best just to put it inside of another subfolder, which I would do whatever the palette is named. And then it'll automatically put them all in that folder so it can reference them. And then it automatically puts it in the tile map view here so you can see everything. So real quick, before we start messing around in here, I'm going to set up the actual tile map in the scene. So if you go to the hierarchy and you right click, you can go down to 2D object, tile map, and then rectangular, since we're just using like a box grid. And it'll make a new grid and have a tile map inside of it. And we want to name the tile map background, because we're going to be making 2 different tile maps to layer them. And I'll explain that in a bit. So then once you make the background, you can right click again, go to 2D, tile map, rectangular. It'll just add another one there, and then we're going to call this one foreground, just so we can differentiate. And again, I'll explain why we're doing that. So now we'll actually mess around in the palette just to like get a feel for some of the tools. And we're going to organize this a little bit so it's easier to draw with the tile map. So it provides a bunch of tools. You have select, move, brush, which means you can like paint all over here. This one is basically like, so normally with a brush you can draw like that, but then this one is like a grid area. You have the ink dropper, which means you can select one, the eraser, which erases, and then the fill bucket, which would fill an area. Yes. In the fill one? So this one is only where you drag from. So if I start dragging from here, it'll only fill what's in the middle of there. Whereas if I had an area that wasn't quite a square like that, and I want to draw with like this or something, it'll fill in the entire area, kind of like paint. Or I could fill in this entire thing. Okay, so we're going to move these around inside of here. So if we want to change where the tiles are located within the palette, we have to click this edit button up here. Otherwise, it just thinks that we're just selecting them to draw on the actual map. So if you click edit, now we're able to like delete, remove, move around all the things inside of here. So the first thing I'm going to do is just erase the cars and the player icon, because those aren't going to be part of the tile map since they're going to be moving around. Those will be actual objects that we make. So we don't need them in the tile map unless you want to have like static ones that just don't move. So then we just want to move everything else around. So if you click on select, you can pick one of the tiles. I don't know why this always comes up. It's kind of annoying. I'm probably doing something wrong, but whatever. And then you can move it to somewhere else, just kind of space it out. Or, yeah. Or you can just click on the ink dropper, click one, do that, and then you can just erase the old one. But I'm just going to move these around so they're kind of organized. Sometimes with corners, it's nice to put them next to each other so you can kind of visualize it, kind of like this. But you can also just kind of like space them out however you want, whatever makes the most sense to you, because then it'll make drawing all this easier when it's actually somewhat organized over here. And you're also able, if you want to select multiple with the ink dropper, you can click and drag, and then it'll like select multiple at once, so you can place multiple tiles. And once you've got them moved around however you want, if you just click on the edit button again, then it'll tell Unity that you're done editing. You don't want to move them around or erase them from here anymore. Then now if you click on them, you can like select them to draw with over here. Oh, inside of here?
Yeah, go to the map.
Yeah, it should just have a bunch of these. There's just a bunch of tile data that the tile map will use when it runs the game. Alright, so once you've got that done, then we can actually start drawing to the tile map. So if we go back to the hierarchy, you've got the background, the foreground, and we want to draw, starting on the background, then we'll draw the foreground. So the background, the reason why we split it up is because the background will have everything that you can walk on, like roads and grass, whereas the foreground is going to be where all the colliders are. So like the buildings, because you can't walk through buildings. So we'll add a collider to the foreground, but not the background. And it'll automatically create the colliders for everything for the most part, just to make that easier. So if you click on background, or in the tile palette, you can also select background. Then it'll know that you want to draw on the background. So you should just be able to click on whatever you want to draw with from the palette. And then you can just draw something, some roads connected if you want, it doesn't matter. I'll give you guys a couple minutes just to play around with it. I think it's usually easiest just to draw the roads, and then if you use the paint bucket, it's really easy just to fill in the area around, because the paint bucket will, like, I don't know. It's weird when it's not inside of something, but it's very nice. Alright, so once you have a little bit of a background drawn, if you're still drawing, that's fine. Next part's also pretty straightforward. If you switch it to the foreground, then we can draw the buildings. However, if you noticed, it's going behind it for some reason. So we don't want that. So if you click on the foreground and then you go to the inspector, you can change the order and layer to 1. So Unity sorts, like the higher the number is, the closer it is to the screen, so it'll render it. Yeah. It would also work. So that works when they're the same. Oh, maybe not. I don't know. Sometimes that works when it's the same order, like if they're both 0 and they're both in the same layer. But in this case, we just want to like make sure it's always in front of it. So I'm just going to change the order and layer to 1. You could also make sorting layers. But in this case, we don't really need that, so just changing the number works. So now, the buildings, we can place on the foreground, on top of the grass. If you are still on the background and you try to replace a building, you can see that there is no longer grass behind it now, because you basically just replaced the grass tile. So we don't want to do that, because otherwise you'll have to Control Z a lot and get back to what it was. So I'm just going to place a bunch of buildings surrounding the roads, and then these will provide We'll put a collider on these, and then the player can't walk through all over the map because the buildings will be blocking their ability to walk. And the different size buildings will also cover their whole respective area. So in this case, like the long building, it'll block the whole space that it covers. So place some of these buildings too. Got the pizza shop. Yes, these ones. I think that is that one. There's one thing I wanted to point out. If you are having problems where this is like centered or something on the grid, sometimes you got to go into the Sprite Editor again, and then click on it, and then you got to like change the pivot, maybe to custom. You can change the pivot to probably any of these, but I think custom's probably the one you want. And then the pivot is like wherever the center of the sprite is. So if it's like being weird for some reason, you can move it to 0.25 on the X and then 0.5. And then it should adjust that so it's like centered with the grid and not like actually centered. If that makes sense. I don't know. Sometimes sometimes Unity gets it right, sometimes it doesn't, so you got to go in and manually change some of the data. All right, so once you've got some buildings just kind of spread around, we're going to go ahead and just add the collider really quick. So if you go to foreground in the hierarchy, and then go to the inspector for it, you can click Add Component. And then if you search Tile Collider 2D, you can select that, and then it will automatically put a collider around every single tile. But if you notice, for some things, it auto-generates them based on whatever the pixels are. So in this case, like the house, it auto-generated kind of goofy because it's not like it's got invisible pixels here. So we're going to change that because otherwise the player could walk and squeeze back through here, and we don't want that. We want them to not be able to walk through the entire tile because there's a building there. So in order to do that, we got to go back to the sprite where it all came from, and back into the Sprite Editor. And then now, kind of up by where the slice was, if you go to click on Sprite Editor, and then now we change it to the custom physics shape, then we'll be able to edit all of the colliders for all of the sprites inside of here. So if we click on any one of the boxes, by default they just like have nothing, which means that Unity is going to do its best to guess what the collider should look like. So if we want to edit it, we have to click on the box we want to do, and then you click Generate up here at the top, and then it will show you what it thinks the collider should be. In this case, we don't want it to be like this. We want it to be a square. So we can click and drag these boxes, and you can put them in the corners. Some of them, like this one here, we don't need it anymore. So if you select it, once it's blue, you can click Delete, and then it'll delete it. So in this case, we only want the 4 that are in the corners because it's just a box. We don't need to have the unnecessary points there. So now you can see there's just a giant box, so all the points are in the corners, and that's exactly what we want. So now, since we want to do this to all of them, instead of individually editing every tile to do that, you can just click Copy up next to the Generate button, and then now we can just hit Paste on all the other ones that we want the box to be on, which is pretty much all of them. Except for the tall buildings. I'll get to that in a second. Actually, I'm just going to click Paste All, because most of them is the box, which is like fine. But then for the tall buildings, we don't want it to be a box or a square because it's a rectangle. So in this case, we can just edit these and make them rectangular so it fits the whole box or the whole thing it's in. Again, copy and paste into the other one. And then same with the long building, we also got to change that so it fits the whole thing. And then since we hit paste all earlier, all the other ones should be a square. You might want to come back at some point and change the car once we get there. But for right now, don't worry about it. And then once you're done with that, you can just hit apply and close out of the Sprite Editor. So now if we click on the foreground again, you'll notice it still looks kind of wonky. That's just because Unity hasn't updated anything. So if you just like draw another thing, it'll update. Or if I click play, I think it'll update the old ones. It should do it automatically. Yeah, so after I click play and then stop it again, now you can see that all of the colliders are boxes. And it should only have colliders around whatever you put in the foreground grid. If you put anything in the background grid, it won't have colliders, so like the grass. And then a little trick, if you want the player not to be able to like walk on this grassy area for some reason, you can just redraw tile grasses over this and then they won't be able to walk through it. But otherwise, like this one, then you could walk through the grass. Depends on what you want to do. So once you kind of got everything, in the folders that you downloaded from the,
I guess it's a weird question, but I think I remember games having a certain point where you have something overlapping. Like for example, in the top right, you would have a building that's too up, but it would cover the road, but when you go behind the building, it would show the road.
Yeah, so if it would show the road. You'd probably have to do some coding for that. Like if you're talking about like when you can see through it, so you know where you're at. Yeah. In 3D stuff, that's called dithering. If you want to look into it, typically people just use shaders because it's a lot easier, and then you just check where the camera is, and it'll automatically. But otherwise, stuff like this, you could probably cheese that, so you don't have to get into all the shaders and stuff. But we're just not going to worry about that for now. If you wanted, yes. So if you wanted to say have that where you could still walk through the building like that, you could just edit the like collider or whatever. So you could change the collider so it's only like half, just so. That's off. Why is that off? I don't know. But anyways, you could change the collider so it's only like halfway, so that you could place this like with a road behind it, and then the player could still walk through it, and then you would have to do some other stuff. So again, if you go to the other folders that were in here, you should have a player prefab, and all we have to do to get this to work is just drag it in because I've already set everything up on a road or something on the inside of the map. And if you notice, it's just a circle. So we don't want it to be a circle because that's lame. And so we want to change it to something. And since we already split up the tile map, we should still have the player down here. Not the tile map, the sprite map. So if you open it up, you can just click and drag it into the sprite slot for the player, and it'll have a nice icon here. And then the prefab I made, so the collider is just a little ball at the bottom, which allows for the player to walk all the way up the sidewalk. And like the top of them kind of just phases through things. So once you drag the player in and you set the texture, you can just click play. And then assuming that all of the colliders are all set up right, I should just be able to walk around. There is one thing though. So the player has a camera on it. So if you delete the camera that's already in the scene, if there is one, then the camera will follow the player around the map. But there is one problem. You can probably see it already, other than that collider not doing that. There's lines all over the place, and there's a reason for that. So how the graphics works is it's trying to like blend them together, which works with, again, bigger textures and like 3D stuff. And we don't want that. We want it to tell it not to really do that. I don't know exactly what it does. But anyways, I know how to fix it, so that's all that matters. So if you go to Edit, and then you go to Project Settings, and inside of Quality, there's a bunch of options, and all we want to do is go to Anti-Aliasing and disable it. Alright, so now kind of just walk around. I did something wrong there. That's why. So yeah, it's hard to get used to. Even I still do this, but sometimes if you accidentally draw something on the foreground, sometimes drawing stuff will be weird. Or in this case, there'll be a collider there, and I can't get through. And so I don't want to do that, so I got to erase it. And then redraw it on the background. All right, so I believe that concludes the tile mapping workshop. If anybody has any questions or wants to learn more, like, I don't know, send me a message or something. If I don't know it, I'll give you a YouTube link that I have probably seen before. Otherwise, I'm also going to post the video link from last year. That one also includes animated tiles. So if you want to learn how to animate them like water or something, you can watch that and just cut through it and just get that part. That, I believe, for that one, you have to have that other package I talked about at the beginning, the extras or whatever. It has stuff for that. Maybe some code. I don't remember. All right, so this is the... That's weird. This is the tile map that we did last year. So tile maps can also be used for, yeah, like Mario type stuff. So in this case, we did animated ones. Yeah, animated tiles, and then there's ways to also have collisions with them. This box actually isn't a tile. This one's just an object. So even though it is the size of a tile, just to push it around. Whereas if you wanted like the true Mario, like pixel perfect, you would have it as an actual tile, and it would move if you would. You'd have to go into the code. But yeah, I'll post the link in the Discord for this tutorial if you want to go through it. And it'll show how to do the animated tiles, as well as the collisions with the tiles. So in this case, it just deletes them. But you could also have it... actually, these aren't tiles, I think. These are all objects. But yeah, it's just cheesing it. I think it's a lot more complicated to implement with like a action with the actual tile, because it's all technically one object. So it's like you'd have to detect a collision, and then you would also have to check where the player is, and it's a lot easier just to have separate objects that are all prefab, so it uses the same stuff.